Yes, we are live. I'm back with my friend Amelia. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Very well. I just did my homework, like I told you, and I reviewed the documentary. And thanks so much for reaching out to me and suggesting that we do this. It's going to be exciting to get your perspective,
Mm.
and I'm sure you have a lot to say. So I'll give you the floor, and you can sort of introduce why, like, what happened. Did you watch it? Like, what's the story?
Well, I did. I was surfing Hulu to find something to watch, and of course, anything about the Pope gets my attention, especially when it's something on Hulu or Netflix that's secular. And I don't consider myself anti Pope Francis or Pope, supportive of the bandwagon Pope. Coming from a journalist perspective, I like both sides. I like to kind of get the entire information. So I watched the video. It's a series, I guess, where they bring 10 young adults between the ages of, I think it's about 20 to 25 years old, and they meet with Pope Francis, and some of them are not even Catholic. I think there's a Muslim in the group, and some who have fallen away from the faith, and an agnostic or two. And so I like the perspective that it was from a whole different range of perspectives and ideas. So what I did find on the video was actually the understanding to some degree that Pope Francis had from all of the perspectives, and it didn't appear like there was any subject that was off limits. And they were they were pretty black and white sometimes with the Pope. But I think it gives us a range, because sometimes what I saw in that video is what we have to understand, that from a media perspective, journalist perspective, we read headlines and we assume what that we know what the Pope meant about anything. This was kind of an uncut, candid explanation that he gave to these young adults, and we are losing young adults in the culture, not only the Catholic Church but Christianity as a whole. And so to get their perspective and to see him directly answer their questions. You don't have to read headlines, you don't have a new spin of some propaganda agenda. You just get his blatant answers to many of these issues, and I think that that's beneficial not only for Catholics but for those who are non-Catholic, because you strip away the propaganda and you just get it straight from the Pope, whether you agree or not.
Did you find yourself uh, fantasizing like if you were there, how would you have responded to those same questions? It's pretty tempting to do that, right?
It is, and you think that you know what he is going to say, and then he doesn't. And you're going, "Well, that was a better way to answer that probably than what I would
Yeah.
have." But and of course you find yourself fantasizing as well, about if you were sitting in that group, what would you ask him?
Ah.
You know, if you were given the rare opportunity that they had, what is the one thing you would want to ask the Pope? And I think they did a very thorough job of covering the topics that most of us would have asked about. And so you kind of get those answers anyway. But yeah, it's fun to go, oh, he's going to answer it this way, and then he doesn't. And you're going, well, that sounds better. But
Yeah. Do you think what's your impression like? I mean, it's hard to like, we're not supposed to judge the heart, right?
sure.
But we can read the cues and the body language and the nonverbal stuff and the verbal stuff. We can interpret all of that and we can put together an idea. Like I have an idea about you. I'm probably wrong, but I got a certain idea about you, what you're about, and all these sorts of things. And the more questions I ask, the more I can like confirm or reject these hypotheses. But same thing with Pope Francis or anyone, my wife. But you get to know people. But
Sure.
do you think it's a concerted effort, or is it just natural? It's just the most natural thing in the world. So an effort or no effort to be diplomatic? Is it just the way he is, or is he thinking, well, I have a hard truth here, but how do I couch this in the most gentle way possible? And it's just like a habit that he's adopted to make people feel comfortable, or is it just this is how he thinks? He just naturally accommodates people. He's diplomatic, he's tactful, and he's very gentle. What do you think?
Well, I think it depends on the subject. When he was speaking about things like the role of women in the church, he was pretty forceful, and it just kind of seemed to come natural about this is the theology, and it's a woman being priest and pope just isn't going to happen. But I think that he seems a little more diplomatic and careful with his words when he addresses things such as the immigration crisis. He even makes the reference, I think, he said some European countries, but I'm not going to name them because of diplomatic issues. He's pretty black and white, but I do think it becomes natural for him to address concerns of the human heart and real life concerns that I believe the church really ignores to some degree. Like, it was pretty impressive, to me, when he's addressing and I thought it was kind of ironic as well, God maybe, when he's addressing the issue about the girl who had, issues with depression and self-image and suicidal ideations, and he's speaking about how God is with us in the storms of life and the good and the bad times,
Right,
and then there's a
right,
thunderstorm,
right.
right? And he doesn't even miss a beat. He's like, "Oh, yeah, well, there's a storm, and that isn't that just like," and it's just like it flowed natural, and I'm like, "Well, I'd have never done that."
I see the genius in the Pope. I see the genius in him. I always have. And there's so many voices online telling me, no, he's Antichrist, he's Antichrist. But I'm just like, no, this man is a genius. He's a Christian. He's a saintly old man with wisdom, and he's wrong about a bunch of stuff. He's wrong about a bunch of stuff. So what? So what? What do you
Sure,
expect? What do you expect?
sure.
Have you met have you met someone that's perfect? I mean, other than Jesus and Mary? I mean, and you haven't even physically met them in the flesh yet. So like, I mean, where is this bar that you're setting your bar a little bit too high? But no, I'm touched by him. I was brought to tears by Pope Francis, watching him and listening to him, his humanity. He's not faking, he's not pretending to love
Mhm.
his fellow man. He's not some academic socialist communist who loves the idea of man. He loves actual humans. He loves them. He had a genuine warmth and camaraderie with these people. And I think he went a little bit too soft at times, especially like with the whole Tinder discussion. I thought he was
Yeah,
weakest on
yeah,
that. He
yeah.
was very weak on
He was.
that.
He was.
But he always makes a point to start with the soft message and the inclusive message, and then to say, but we have to call things by their real name, and we have to call a spade, and the reality. His comment about the hitman with abortion was like so powerful and
Yeah,
so
and he said it, and,
yeah,
he has said it before in homilies and things, but,
yeah,
like, he blatantly told
yeah,
her, and I was like, "Oh, okay." But and he re-emphasized it when she challenged him on it, right?
yep.
But I do think that in his answers, I do agree with you that he should have been a little more forceful about the Tinder thing, and I kinda cringed when and I don't remember the exact verbiage of it, but in speaking about the Tinder thing
Christopher
and
Columbus.
about well, yes, that too, but he also said something to the lines of, that basically morality was relative, and, if
When
you
he said your truth.
yes,
No, no,
your
no, that
truth.
was a
Eh,
mistranslation. It was a mistranslation. He said the truth. He said the
did
truth.
he?
I listened carefully. Yeah, la verdad. He said the truth, but they put the subtitle your truth.
Gotcha. But I think that it's one of those things that I'm like you. I think he was more forceful than I expected him to be about abortion. I expected him to kind of throw the soft darts about abortion. Um, but I do think that he was a little more forceful than I expected him to be about the women in the role of the church.
Yeah, he actually
I
said
do think
he actually said, you know, you can have different ideas about it, but there's only one right idea, and the other ideas are wrong. It's like, wow, wow,
But I do think he should have been more forceful about the pornography and
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
and the masturbation and stuff. Because
yeah,
let's just
yeah,
be honest, pornography's a larger issue than we want to admit.
yeah,
We like to throw darts of the LGBTQ community and abortion because it's public, but meanwhile we're going and doing pornography,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, and things, and so I would have liked to have seen him be a little more forceful
yeah,
about that. And I would have I agree with him on the immigration issue to
yeah,
where we need to welcome everyone.
yeah,
But I would have liked to have seen him kind of draw that line in the sense of there is a distinguishment between welcoming the immigrants and doing it illegally,
yeah,
you know, and every immigrant should be treated the same as we would and should be welcomed as long as the laws of the land are followed. And I
yeah,
think I wish he would have made that distinction. But what I do like about the entire thing is that it would have been easy for them to script this, so to speak.
yeah.
It would have been easy for them to pick 10, 20 to 25-year-olds who were Catholic, who were devoted Catholic, come from strong Catholic families, and you know what they're going to say. But I think out of the 10, maybe 2 or 3 were actually strongly devoted Catholics,
Maria,
maybe?
Maria,
She was. Yeah, boy, she didn't hold back either, did she?
he liked her too.
Um,
He liked her too, even though he gave her the sternest warning of anyone.
yeah, yeah.
You're, yeah,
Better be ready.
you better be ready. Your faith, if your faith is authentic, it's going to be tested. So
Yeah,
that
yeah,
was, but he really did like her too. He did like her, and he let her speak for
he
him.
did.
He
He
let
did.
her speak for him.
Yeah,
She was the
yeah,
bad cop. He was the good cop. She was the bad cop, and I
yeah.
think that's his strategy generally. That's his strategy generally, because
What,
there are plenty of bad cops emphasizing
yeah,
clarity over charity. There are plenty. We
yeah.
don't need one on the throne of Peter.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I also liked and what in fact what I was impressed with was not Pope Francis. I was impressed with the young adults because they set the example that I think we're missing in this culture. Even though they disagreed and at times strongly disagreed with each other and they had facial expressions to show it, but they could respectfully and politely discuss really controversial issues on either side to where we get on social media and we're throwing accusations and attacks toward each other and we have lost the ability to sit and agree to disagree.
Yeah.
But they actually set that tone and that atmosphere, and I think we can learn a lot, not just from the Pope, but from them and from watching how they interact with each other.
They
And
should
he sat back and let them.
release the behind the scenes, the vetting process to how they found these
Yep,
people, how they
yep,
tested them, how they
yep,
probed them, and how they made sure it wasn't going to be a disaster. Because believe me,
yep.
it could have been a
Sure,
disaster. It could have been a
sure.
disaster.
I mean, you get a Muslim with some agnostic and atheist and those who are non-binary, and you throw them in a room together with the Pope. I mean, it could have gone sideways. But I just I think that the way they did it was as unbiased as you could possibly do, which is impressive for something that's on Hulu.
Yeah, you know, I try to take a leaf from Pope Francis's book. I'm not tactful or diplomatic, but I am open to people with different ideas, and I'm also aware of the fact that God has a plan for everyone who has the breath of life in them. It ain't over till the fat lady sings. There's always hope for repentance and for change. So on my podcast, when I talk to a Satanist or an atheist or a Jew or Muslim or whatever, I have that Pope Francis approach. It's authentic. I really love this person, and I want them to be authentic in their quest for truth, whatever part of the journey they're on. It doesn't really matter to me. We're all on a journey, and it's, you know, we haven't arrived. I haven't arrived. In my Catholic walk with Christ, I have not arrived. I can't sit back on my laurels and say I'm a saint and I've got nothing. There's no room for improvement. Here, let me point out the speck in your eye because I don't have a log in my eye. I'm not there yet. And it's the same thing with the agnostic or the atheist or like that nun who left the faith. I thought that was very touching the way Pope Francis handled that. He saw the humanity and he said, don't get bogged down in ideologies, but be authentic, seek the truth, and there's someone with
Yep.
you. There's someone with you.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
amazing. That was amazing.
Yep. Yeah, he basically, without telling her that your truth is in the church, he basically told her, if you go seek the truth, you'll find that you're not alone, and you'll figure out that he's not left you even though you left the faith. And I think that's the message that, and I really liked his explanation when they come to the non-binary and the LGBTQ community. And I really liked that his statement, and I wrote it down because I thought it was brilliant. It's adjectives are not baptized,
Mm,
nouns are.
mm,
People are, and I believe in people.
yeah.
And I think we have lost the ability to understand that regardless of what sin someone may be entangled in, that those sins are not baptized, that people are baptized. And if we take the lesson from Jesus' example of the woman caught in adultery, right? Jesus calls her to repentance and he tells her to go sin no more, but he does it as the last thing. He loves her and shows her grace and compassion first. He doesn't condemn her sin first. And I think we have gotten into this culture, and that Pope Francis dispels it pretty easily by the way he reacts to these young adults, in the sense of you can be strong about theology. He was even strong about the theology of women and their role in the church. He was strong about the theology of abortion, but he begins his answer with understanding and grace and recognition that they are passionately affected by these issues. What I think is interesting is 80% of the people that Pew Research did a research study years ago, and it said 80% of people before they are 29 years old leave the church if they are going to leave. This is the demographic that is leaving the church. And for the demographic that is leaving the church, like the young man, I forgot his name, that his family was active and then they left the church. For this demographic who is either not religious or leaving the church, we are arguing within the church about the wrong things. And the reason we are losing these people is that we spend 90%, 80 to 90% of our time on social media arguing about the TLM. There is no, there is not one question in these 10 people who gave a crap about whether it was Novus Ordo or TLM. They wanted about the issues that impact their life, and that's why some of them have left the faith. They don't care what mass you go to. And yes, it's important to understand how we worship God, and it's important to understand the mass. But if we are focused on that, we are missing all of these issues that are driving people away from church. And if they're driving people away from church, they're driving people away from Christ. And these young adults didn't care. They didn't ask about the different mass in TLM. They asked about the human issues that are affecting them. And we need to stop arguing and get on our platforms and our selfish, self-centered belief that this is kind of our soapbox and this is where we're going to stand on. Because it's not going to reach people the way meeting these people in the issues that affect them are. So
So,
I think Pope Francis is genuine and he's able to address those issues
yeah.
when we get singular focused on other things.
Absolutely. The most uncomfortable part for me, to be honest, was I felt like Pope Francis was being a little bit too worldly and defensive about the Opus Dei sex abuse, the kid that
Yep.
was abused. I
Yeah,
found it was
he got
defensive.
super
It was
defensive. Yeah,
defensive, and
yeah.
it wasn't focused on the mystical,
Mhm.
spiritual aspect of life in this fallen world. It was ignoring the spiritual,
Yep.
and it was just
Yep.
saying, well, we want to have, get the message out that we're with you, we stand with you, and all that. Well, that's nice, that's nice, but
That's lovely, but what and he wasn't that defensive against the kid that was actually a victim. It was the other one who started challenging him and
uh,
saying, "But I
yeah,
don't hear. I'm not a victim, but I don't hear you doing enough." And
yeah,
he kind of was taken back
yeah,
and got defensive, and I'm like, "Whoa, wait a
yeah,
minute."
yeah,
And rather than just saying, "Well, we've been addressing this for a while. It didn't just start today." Okay, well that's a good acknowledgement. But what are you doing to address it? Other than this big PR campaign of you're not alone anymore and we hear you, we see you, but how are you keeping these individuals from being abused? How are you actually disciplining these priests who are found guilty? How are you stopping the cover up? That's what these young adults wanted to hear. That's what I wanted to hear. What are you doing? And he kind of gave this ambiguous, kind of defensive answer and moved on.
yeah,
And I'm like, that was probably one of the key aspects that he could have made a dent
yeah,
in the image of the church
yeah,
if he was able to lay like a foundation of here's step by step what we have done, here's what we're going to do.
yeah,
But when you see just one or two people like Cardinal McCarrick or somebody, and you see one or two examples in all of these accusations, you get the impression that, well, that cardinal was just kind of the scapegoat and thrown under the bus type thing.
yeah. Well, I don't know if you've ever had a low-paying job where there's a lot of pressure and there's never enough time. You'll never
Yeah,
be able to do the task. Like the burden
right,
is too big. It's overwhelming. But I
right.
felt like I was sympathizing with him because he's never going to be able to do enough. The church will never be able to do enough in this sick fallen world. It's
No,
never going to be enough. It's never going to be enough. I don't care what you do. I
yeah,
don't care what you
yeah,
do. It's not going to be enough. It won't be enough. But what I said in my little video that I made in preparation for this, what I said is it's the same accusation we could level against Jesus Christ when he walked the earth. Like today at the mass, the Canaanite woman came, she made the effort, she begged, and she finally, through all her pleading and her humility, she moved Christ to heal her daughter, or whatever it was. But you know, that atheist guy, Alejandro, or whatever his name was, he could have said the same thing to Jesus. Well, yeah, this one woman, she made the effort, she came, but what about all the others? It's the same
right.
thing. So I see Christ and his church as one flesh. It's a mystical thing. I see the vicar of Christ in persona Christi. He's Christ. He's, to the extent that he's Christian, and that could be up for debate, but I think he's Christian. So, I see an analogy there. I see, like, it doesn't matter what Christ did when he walked the earth. It wasn't enough. He could have done more. Could he not have done one more healing, one more miracle? Could he not?
Right.
And like I said in my
Sure.
video, if not one, why not two? If two, why not three? And so on and so forth. So we have to have a spiritual, mystical understanding of what is salvation and what is our journey in this sick fallen world between birth and death. Now that Adam and Eve, our first parents, fell, what is the point? What is the point of our life? Why are we here, and where are we going, and how can we be instruments of God, and how can we first and foremost say yes to the graces that we need to be saved ourselves first before looking after others? And why is it that Jesus Christ didn't do more in the worldly plane, politically or healing or whatever your pet peeve is, like whatever it is you're excited about, your issues that you're excited about, we could always ask, why didn't he do more? And it's the same thing with the church and with Pope Francis. So I think that if we take this mystical vision that I have, it relieves a lot of that pressure that I felt Pope Francis crumbling under the weight of the responsibility and the burden and the pressure and the fact that he'll never be able to satisfy everyone, especially those people who don't want to be satisfied. They want to complain. They want to gripe. It's a satanic
Yeah.
attack on Jesus Christ. When they're attacking Pope Francis, they're attacking Jesus Christ.
Well, and I think he had a point that many of us or many individuals in the church miss is that when he was speaking about the broken and hindered image of the church, and he turns it back on the laity and turns it back on the church as a whole and says, well, you have a testimony. How many times have we actually had someone to stand up and tell their testimony of what Christ and the church has done on social media rather than spewing hatred because of something the Pope has done or didn't do. And I think that he has a point in the sense of we as Catholics, we as Christians have a responsibility, and our responsibility is to be a member of this family and a member of Christ's family. And Christ gave one singular focused mission before he ascended into heaven. In Matthew 28, he says, "Here is what I want you to do. And I want you to go and spread the gospel. I want you to go baptizing people. I want you to go teaching them the things that I taught you." And we have missed that because we get wrapped up in legalism and who does what in what way because I prefer this over the other. And we're missing the opportunity to bring these young people back to Christ. We're missing the opportunity to keep them in the church. Because we are not telling what Christ has done for us, right? Pope Francis has had a great message about, share your testimony because it starts kind of like the nun he gave the reference to who was a martyr. It starts with your testimony and what
Mm,
you did.
yeah.
Because at the end of the day, very few people who are not Catholic are not going to pay attention to Pope Francis. They don't care. When I was Protestant, I didn't care who the Pope was or what he was doing, but if I meet someone who is Catholic and they seem to be making a difference in life and it's tied to their faith, I might pay attention a little bit more. And we have to be the example of the Catholic and maybe the only Catholic or the only Christian most people see. And we have to understand we have that role and responsibility as well to point people to Christ. And arguing and fighting over trivial issues, really, at the end of the day, isn't going to make an eternal difference, but it's also not going to make a difference in those who are not following Christ already. It's not going to help get them to heaven.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's one of the most powerful things about Pope Francis generally, and in the documentary in particular, his emphasis on, the dignity of the person wherever they're at in their journey, and the authenticity of our quest for truth ultimately, because that's what God is, and the idea about the periphery and the marginal and those who need outreach, that need contact, that need to feel loved and supported, and how our hypocritical lip service is
Yep.
damaging the church. It's damaging the church. Your weak sauce cotton candy Catholicism, if I can quote my previous guest, he said that phrase, I never heard it before. Cotton candy Catholicism is worse than useless. Pope Francis didn't explicitly say this. I'm rephrasing it in more powerful terms, but it's worse than useless. Your lip service is worse than useless. It's destroying the reputation of the church. People are not attracted to this fake, hypocritical, club for nice people or whatever he called it. It's just
Yeah.
like it is so powerful and so simple. The message, like you have to, hey, if you're going to call yourself a Christian, it's probably a good idea to act like a Christian and to have,
Right.
to have convictions and to have coherence and to have courage to act on your convictions and to not just give lip service. So, I mean, I feel challenged by that. And I'm aware of that every day anyway, my own weakness and hypocrisy and the fact that I'm just giving lip service. And, I'm aware of that and I'm striving with God's help to overcome that complacency. Like Pope Francis mentioned that, like we want to be comfortable. We want to be comfortable, and it's the same thing in Vatican City.
Yep.
They want to be comfortable, and they start putting up these little
Yep.
walls without realizing they're isolating themselves and they're preventing others from having an authentic contact, or even themselves from being authentic instruments of the grace of God. And it's a tragedy. It's a silent, unnoticed tragedy, and we're all doing it. We're all guilty of it.
Yeah, sure. And I liked his point about that it's easier to judge and point fingers because those people who judge need to
Ah,
look inward and look
uh-huh,
at
uh-huh.
themselves.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And yeah, it's easier to say, well, you're sinning and you're a homosexual and you're in sin and you're going to hell if I'm not a homosexual. Right?
Yeah.
It's easy to say, well, you don't need to be Catholic because you're pro-abortion and because you support abortion when I haven't had an abortion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, not justifying those things, but it's
No.
easier to throw
Yeah.
stones
Yeah.
when we're not living it, and
Yeah. Absolutely.
but you start throwing stones like Jesus said in Scripture, and like Saint Paul said about gossiping. No, wait a minute, we've all gossiped, right? No, you can't give a homily about gossiping because you might step on some toes, right? But
Yeah, well, your homily would have to be couched like this. You'd have to say, "Oh, did you hear about Mary? Did you hear? Do you know how much she gossip? You know how much she gossips? That's bad, isn't it? Yeah, when she does it, it's horrible."
right,
So, gossiping as a means of pointing out the evils of gossiping.
sure, sure, sure.
We're a slippery breed, we fallen humans.
Yes, we are. We are. And we're never going to be perfect, but I think we make the mistake of expecting someone like Pope Francis to be perfect. And we get all up in arms when he's not. Well, he's just as human as we are. He just happens to have a spotlight shown on him and happens to sit on, the seat of Peter. But nobody ever said because he's got those keys that he's perfect, because he's not.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, it's obvious to me that he's human. It's obvious to me that he's flawed, and I even mentioned in my little video that I just did in preparation for this, you know, he, I don't want to point out his flaws, but I mean, he seems a little bit overweight, and he has some health issues related to his
Yep.
weight. And
Mhm. Yep.
I'm like not obese or anything, but my wife says I should lose a little bit of weight or whatever, got a gut. And I'm aware that I like salty food, sweet food, junk food, crappy food. Like, I mean, uh,
Sure.
so like the idea of gluttony, it's another thing we don't talk about in society too much. But like when I look at Pope Francis, I do judge him. I think, okay, well maybe he shouldn't eat so much, you know. But
Oh,
then
and then he mentions how good the cookies are at the very
you know, so that's a case where I am a glutton, and I'm concerned about other, when I see a priest who's overweight, like obviously overweight, it does bother me. It's a prejudice I have. And I shouldn't judge because there are biological reasons and stuff like that too. But it's just as an example, like Pope Pius the 12th, do you remember him? He was
Yes.
like
Yeah.
anorexically skinny or
Yep.
whatever.
Correct.
So I tend to think that he's holier because he was like depriving himself of food or whatever. But that's a prejudice, and I need to like. I also admire another chubby pope, which was John the 23rd. Remember him?
Right. Yep. He was a bit chubby
He
too.
was a
He
bit
was short.
chubby, but so all of this to say that we judge. We're very quick to judge,
We are.
and it's natural. And part of the judgment is an objectively true and good judgment. Like, it's not good to kill your baby, it's not good to kill your grandma, and it's not good to just eat a lot of ravioli. Like he was saying, oh, yeah, I wish I could have more ravioli dinners with my family. Well,
Look, it's perfectly fine to have more of that chocolate cake, right?
but all of this just to say, when it comes to striving for virtue, it's hard. It's hard. It's really hard. And I think that's what makes Pope Francis Christian, authentically Christian, is that he knows that if he just puts a burden on some young person's back, like the Pharisees did, like
Right.
they're pretending to
Right.
help people get into the kingdom of heaven, but they're preventing people from getting into the kingdom of heaven. So I think Pope Francis is painfully aware of that, and he's making a concerted effort to not burden people unnecessarily. And I used the analogy in my video just before that, there is an iron fist inside his velvet glove. There is, there
It's
is,
true.
but he won't reveal that fact too often. Just once in a while.
Right. Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
good approach. It's a good approach.
It is, and, back to your analogy of the food and the glutton, that's also something you're not gonna hear a homily on, right? Because 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 we have potlucks and we have feast days, and we're not going to offend somebody and tell them not to make that macaroni salad. Um, but it takes discipline to break addictions,
Yeah,
and I do think that many of us, especially in a Western higher society culture,
yeah.
are addicted to food.
Oh yeah,
We're addicted to ease and pleasantries and things that taste good. I'm a
yeah,
foodie.
yeah,
And I like food. I like different kinds of food. But just personally, going back to the addiction and breaking an addiction, 2 years ago, I actually went on a diet. And over the course of about 18, 19 months, I lost 100 pounds, believe it or
holy
not.
cow.
I did, and I can actually credit COVID for that. I ended up getting I got COVID twice, and because it kind of zapped me of my energy and gave me some health problems. I'm a fighter, and I'm like, you're not going to win this fight. So I decided to go on this health weight journey. But it's
Ah,
hard because you don't understand how we are addicted to things
yeah,
that we take for granted.
yeah, oh yeah,
And so I can go out to eat and I want that pasta and that chocolate lava cake that they offer, but it's about good and bad choices. And just because my addiction or someone else's addiction is not the addiction to someone else, doesn't mean that we have a right to judge. If we love and we show grace and mercy first, like Christ did, you are going to be this attraction because you're going to be Christ, and everybody's. And I like who, and I don't remember which one said it, that people have become disappointed in the church, but not Christ. And it is the church's responsibility to bring people to Christ. People should not have to research and figure out Christ on their own. They should be going through the gateway of the church who leads them to Christ. But we, as fallible human beings, have wanted to put ourselves on a pedestal and make ourselves feel better. So we pinpoint everyone else's addictions and flaws, like you had said about him being overweight and whatnot, as opposed to someone else's and our own. But yeah, we judge, and we judge way too easily because we feel better when about ourselves when we do that.
well yeah, even beauty, beauty is such a strange thing, like and it is partly subjective, but it's also, there's an objective part to it. um but I mean, I'm guilty of judging people based on their beauty level. Like, I mean, I'm sorry,
Sure,
I
sure,
am. And
sure.
I've got friends who are guilty of judging people based on like perceived IQ or intelligence or academic
Yep.
intelligence. I don't do that. I'm not prone to that. Unless you're a complete idiot. you know you know but so yeah, I'm prone to that a little bit, but not as much as some of my friends who really make a point of it, like, oh, this person's intelligent, or it's like, who cares,
Right.
like, you know.
Right. Intelligence is relative too. But it kind of goes back to the thing with Pope Francis, because we were talking about the immigration and immigrants and how
Mm.
immigrants are judged. And we do.
Yeah.
If we are honest about ourselves, most people would have a conversation with someone who is an immigrant from Ukraine as opposed to someone who comes from Iraq. If you come from Iraq, you're Muslim and you're a terrorist. If you come from Ukraine, you're a victim. Right? And so we judge based on a variety of things. We don't like to think we do, but if we're honest, we do. If we're honest to some degree, we're all racist. If you don't think you're racist, walk down in the middle of a lower income area in the middle of the night and see how you feel as a white person, right? And then suddenly you might realize that you're racist, but you know,
It's amazing, the human condition, and this is this is why I like this pontificate so much, because it's easy, like you've been emphasizing this over and over again, and it's true. It's just easier to fall back on other components of, the checklist, or the religious checklist. It's easier than, you know acknowledging the humanity of others, and fighting for the dignity of others, even our enemies. Can you imagine?
right,
And
right,
there is that there is that problem in society where some people have ill will,
Sure.
so there's a tendency when you listen to Pope Francis to think, well, everyone's just nice and innocent, they're all victims of the circumstance or whatever. That's, there's a component of truth to that to some degree, but there's also the fact that we're selfish and we have ill will and we're going to rape and steal and kill and whatever, just to have.
Yep.
Why? Like, why do people do that? Why? So they can have pleasure, power, money? Like, what are those good reasons? Is that a good reason for war? Like, I mean, should I invade a
Right.
country because I want their oil? Like, I mean, is that a good reason? So the ill will is such a problem, and he didn't talk about it directly, and he doesn't seem to
Yep.
talk about that too often.
He doesn't, and he seems to ignore the inherent tendencies that we have for ill will toward every individual has tendencies to have ill will towards somebody. If we again we like to think that I don't intend any harm toward anyone, but you let someone do something devastating to you. You let someone harm you in some sort of a long-term way that causes PTSD or something, or you let someone murder a family member of yours, and then you let someone do whatever you may be biased or prone to, and suddenly we find ourselves not wanting to forgive. We find ourselves not wanting to show someone grace and mercy who has hurt us, because suddenly it becomes personal. And we all have those areas to where we get in this comfort zone of saying, well, I'm probably going to hell for this, but you know hell is not a phrase, right?
Yeah.
It's not a cute little pun. Mm, but I think we have gotten into this area to where we don't like to talk about someone's ill motives and hatred toward others unless it's some sort of mass shooter or something that we could all agree on had bad motives. Mm, But unless it's a particular incident like that, we like to pretend like we're not evil. Well, if we weren't evil, Christ wouldn't have had to come to the cross. So we all have a bit of ill will toward us, and he does seem to ignore that. And I'm not real sure why. Maybe it's because the same reason priests avoid certain topics. We don't want to step on toes or offend anyone, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I in my podcast and when I talk to people about religion, I tend to emphasize the individual. Okay, so you strive to sin less and to be more virtuous and to please God and to not displease God. And, you know, it's an very individualistic emphasis that I bring to the walk with Christ. And then, of course, there's this whole idea of once you've removed the log from your eye, you could maybe help the other to
Right?
remove the speck from their eye, that
Sure.
sort of thing. That's step two, phase two. Step
Sure.
one, become a saint. Step two, help everybody. But, that's not the only way to envision the Christian walk. There's the sort of communitarian angle, which is valid, which is that it's not an individualistic thing. It's the church is a group, and it has to be two or more in my name before I'll
Sure.
recognize you or whatever. And there's that whole other angle of emphasis which I neglect just because of my temperament or because I'm egocentric or whatever. But I acknowledge it. I do acknowledge it. There's a top down thing. Like I've got a pope and a hierarchy above me, and I do acknowledge that, and I see it has its rightful place and whatever. And when it comes to the dark side and Satan and the way he runs the planet, there are many mafias competing and
Sure.
cooperating as
Sure.
whatever the situation needs. And this is something interesting as a segue. You can respond to that, but I'm just sort of throwing it out there. But the different sort of levels, like from the individual up to the sort of the cooperative. But the second part of this question I'll leave you with is when Pope Francis talked about rebellion and recognizing that for the sake of justice, we have to make change in structures that are established. And that was something that I thought was interesting. And part of me loves the rebelliousness of it, and part of me is cautious about throwing away, tradition and this sorts of things. So you can respond to all that.
Well, I did think it was interesting, and I felt like it was almost an attempted foreshadowing of just kind of throwing out,
Ah.
just brace yourself, right? Because he is seen as a rebellious kind of a pope. And change and new things are not necessarily bad, and they're not necessarily wrong. I do like his example that he gave about the slavery, when the church was silent when we had slavery, because that's just what people did. And I also kind of almost saw a some sort of a hint or foreshadow of at least a change, if not something new in the catechism, because he did say
Ah.
something about the catechism's early in its stages about its teaching about sex. And so I'm like, well, is this a hint that like you're working on something to change? But I think that we as a society do not like change. We don't like things different, and we want to be set in our ways. And just because we do something new or put a new label on it, or it just happens to be directed at a different point, doesn't necessarily make it bad or wrong. And I do often see him criticized as an anti-establishment or anti-tradition pope. Maybe some of the things he has said have presented that. I have gotten that impression in the past and at times. And he is a bit of a rebel, but I think he's a bit of a rebel to some degree where he errs more on the side of recognizing human beings as humans, as opposed to being so kind of black and white about here's the church teaching. Because unless you reach those people and show them the love of Christ, they're not going to care what the church teaches. And so I do think that maybe there's a balance between the two, and I don't think many popes have achieved that balance. They either go to one side or the other. So I think he errs more on the side and falls more on the side of the softball side, so to speak. But it is interesting that he almost foreshadows, perhaps change in the future.
Yeah, well, there is that topic, the controversial topic of the death penalty, and I've got some online friends who are, upset with Pope Francis for, you know, messing with that, and to some extent, I agree with them. Like, I think that we can't rule out the use of the death penalty. I like the way it was phrased originally, like, just there are rare exceptional cases where it's the last resort or whatever, like I think that's a reasonable position to have. Like, let's make sure the innocent aren't being falsely accused and tried and convicted and killed, like,
Right,
but the mystical supernatural component of my faith tells me that physical death is not the worst thing. It's not. And suffering injustice is not the worst thing. It's not the worst thing. Sorry, it's
right,
just not the worst thing. There are people like
right,
read the lives of the saints. They suffered injustice. Okay,
right.
so it's a two-edged sword, and I see both sides of the coin. But there are other little changes. Like they made changes to the Lord's Prayer. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, I don't know which languages it affected. I guess they made the changes in English and a lot of the different vernacular languages. Is that the case?
Yeah, yeah, that's my understanding of it. I haven't researched it much, but that's my understanding of it.
I view things like that. I view things like that as very human, man-made traditions that are silly. And if you'll
Right.
forgive me for saying so, I think it's stupid to
Sure,
change the language of that. Like it was unnecessary.
sure.
It's
Yeah,
unnecessary. It's just like we all understand what the Lord's Prayer means. I don't think anyone needs the language changed or whatever, but who
right.
cares? Let them do their thing and probably have good intentions, and who cares, whatever. So I'm not going to make a big deal about it. Same thing with any changes that come in the catechism. It's like the catechism is not as binding as, formal dogmas or
Sure.
whatever. So when I read the catechism for the first time, I thought it was way too liberal. already.
Yeah, it is.
I thought it was just very progressive, and but I also knew where it lies in terms of the hierarchy of magisterial teachings or whatever, and I took it with a grain of salt. And I read other catechisms, and the ones in the past seemed a little bit more conservative or whatever. But who cares? But so all of this to say that I could get upset, I could get on a bandwagon. How
Mm,
dare they interfere or whatever? Well, that's what they do. That's what they do. That's what they
I do.
do. They're doing
Well,
their
and
thing.
we are a very critical people. So if the Pope sat back and did not say anything or do anything, then we would be throwing stones at him for being quiet.
Yeah.
Why doesn't he do this or why doesn't he do anything? He sits on his throne and doesn't do anything. But then when he does something, we criticize what he does because we're a critical people. We think we know everything that's best, and we can judge others, and that's what we do.
Well, he made a
But
point. He made a point about the culture changing and about how that provides opportunities for change or
mm,
whatever. And like it was very vague language. It was vague language, but I like the acknowledgement, and the people on the right, they don't like this language, but I like this language about adapting to the changing culture. I like that. I like that. Why? Because it's not a museum for saints, it's a hospital for sinners. And it's just like we live in an organic, changing, mutable world where things are in flux, and God is not a moron. God is aware from the beginning of everything as it plays out, and he's participating
mm,
actively with his graces, and we are meant to be instruments of that grace, which means that we're part of the change. We adapt to the change. We're flexible, we're organic, we're alive, we're part of the living body. So I'm not afraid of that language of adapting to the culture and making changes where necessary, and even at the risk of making mistakes. Even at the
sure.
risk of making mistakes, so what?
Well, and adapting to the culture does not mean that you're changing truth.
No.
When you adapt to something that has changed, all you are doing is changing the ways that truth is taught and that truth reaches people. It's kind of like it's kind of like if you want to sit back and if the church never got on social media or it never got on the
Uh,
internet because the internet is new and it's a different culture.
yeah,
Nobody criticizes us for live streaming mass. Well, that's an adaptation. And so just because we adapt to the teachings because they didn't have the non-binary issue, for example, 20 years ago, just because we begin to adapt to that because we have to address those issues as society changes and evolves doesn't mean truth changes. It just means it's a different way of addressing the problems that we face because we didn't face those issues in the past. And you can't stop society and culture from evolving. You have to adapt to the ways you bring them to Christ. And if you use archaic manners and ways of doing that, you're going to miss the people anyway because they've already gotten on social media. They're already on 12 or 13 social media apps. And if you don't want to adjust and evolve to that, then you're just out of the loop, which means you can't reach people for the gospel. So I'm okay with the adjusting and the changing to the culture because that doesn't necessarily mean truth is changing or he's changing anything that sacred scripture teaches.
the church is active in the world as it should be, and the world is, sad to say, the world is worldly. Like the world
Right.
is full of corruption and mafias and enemies working from within. Pope Francis mentioned something that I find very, very important to emphasize, which is that the reform of the church has to come from within. The reform of the church has
Yep.
to be from
Yep.
within. Now, I always emphasize, like I told you, I always emphasize, my own personal conversion, getting right with God and these sorts of things as the starting point, as a member of the church, like rather than bugging you about your
Sure.
problems, I should
Sure.
focus on, getting right with God myself. But, that transformation of the church from within, like we look to the example of the saints, how they were the greatest reformers because like you said, it's just natural that people are drawn to truth and goodness, and they're drawn to Jesus Christ. So the saints were like living embodiments of Jesus Christ because they died to self. and so they attracted people, they converted people by the
Sure,
thousands, by the tens of
sure.
thousands. So we know, the irony is we know what works. We know what works. We know
Yeah.
that the world would be a better place and God would be very happy if we decided, made a firm resolution to never sin again and to be a saint. To be a saint.
Yep. Yep.
Why don't we try it? Why don't we try it?
Because we're too busy throwing stones at other people who aren't saints.
I'll make a deal with you. If you'll do it, if you'll start, then I'll start. I'm just being funny. I'm just being funny. But the basic
Oh,
idea is like I'm looking around, I'm saying, well, it would be cool like if everyone was Catholic and if everyone was good and if everyone was generous and if everyone was virtuous. That would be cool. Then it would be like easy for me to ride that wave and
sure.
you know, we want to follow. Like I mean, I'm the last person to admit that I want to follow the group. The last person. Okay, I'm a rebel individualist. But when it comes to being a bold follower of Christ, I kind of want some examples around me. I kind of want to make excuses because of the poor examples around
Sure,
me, and
sure.
it's just easier that way. And I could look down my nose at Hitler and all the bad guys in history and say, well, I'm not like that, like the what's that
Right.
story in the Bible about the guy who's praying about how
I
good
was right.
I'm not like those
Thank
people.
God that I'm not like him.
That's a natural tendency. So it's really like everything we've said about Pope Francis, about those young adults, about ourselves, about the church, the enemies of the church, whatever. It boils down. What does it boil down to? It boils down to, God created a good world. We fell from grace, and the good news is we can still have salvation. We can still have eternal life. And in the meantime, there's a spiritual battle. There are fundamental choices that need to be made, right? And so I feel like if there's one criticism I have of Pope Francis in that documentary, is that he missed out on that mystical vision of the spiritual battle, the spiritual
Yeah,
battle. Um, and I said to myself, and I said in my little commentary before, that maybe his tactic is to know the audience and to know where they're at and to meet them where they're at. So to have a more worldly approach. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think that's a fair assessment, especially when they're in their 20s and they're throwing out things like Tinder, and he's like, I don't know what that is. And so I think it I think he is trying to balance this way of trying to understand not only just his audience, but understand uh, the people, the world, the different age groups, because his age trying to connect with a 20-year-old is difficult sometimes when they're talking about social media apps, and they're talking about, like, the who was it that was shocked when she asked him, does he know what non-binary is? And he said, yes. She's like, oh, okay. He's not that out of touch. But I think that we do have to give him some grace because he's in a difficult position, and he has to kind of bridge this gap between, here's the black and white truth, but let me understand where you're coming from, because Jesus did that. He began to try to understand, and like the Samaritan woman or the woman caught in adultery, he understood where they were coming from first, and he kind of walked this middle way of reaching people. And doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean that it's changing truth, but I do think he comes from a worldly perspective sometimes, because you have to meet them where they're at right now. And if they are in the world and not in the church, and coming from a spiritual perspective, you have to meet them where they're at, or you're not going to be on the same playing level. And so I do think that that's probably, especially in the limited time that he had with the series, I think that that's probably maybe where he was coming from, because they were of such a different generation.
If you read the Old Testament, you and the prophets in particular, you often get the sense that God uses certain men as prophets to give stern warning and to chastise the wrongdoers. Even John the Baptist, Saint John the
Sure,
Baptist, with the
sure.
whole marriage thing. Um, so I think, there's a new economy since the Messiah came. Obviously, there's a new economy. We're in the age of the church now, and I think it's a kinder, gentler, softer economy now. But there's still a place for the harsh realities, that iron fist in the
Sure.
velvet glove. And I'm just wondering in terms of responsibility for you as an individual Christian, do you ever feel like I have an opportunity now to warn this person and to chastise them? And it's actually a spiritual uh, act of mercy. What do they call these acts of mercy? The physical ones, like feed the poor and bury the dead, these sorts of things. What do they call
Oh,
these?
corporal works of mercy.
Yeah, the corporal works of mercy and the spiritual works of mercy. It's actually a spiritual work of mercy to chastise the sinner, right? Like, so I
Sure.
think I think that's a component of every Christian's walk with God, is to call out sin. And when I think about the harshness of some of the prophets, the way they delivered their message, and sometimes the absurdity of the theater that they went through to make their
Sure.
point,
Sure.
it was outlandish and very bold, and they put their lives at risk most of the time, I would say. So I'm just wondering, personally, you as a Christian, do you ever feel like, hey, God's put me in this awkward situation where I could rise up and play that sort of bad cop role like the prophets of old, but I haven't got the fortitude, so I'm just gonna like be polite and nice. Have you been in that awkward situation and you felt disappointed later? Or have you never just found yourself in that situation? Or did you rise to the occasion and sort of chastise your fellow sinner?
Well, I'm I'm fairly opinionated and black and white, and I do not have a filter most of the time. So, not saying something is probably not something that happens very
Okay,
often with me.
okay.
But I do try to find a balance between recognizing the dignity and value of the person, despite whatever situation we are in. Now, I do think we have misunderstood that recognizing and valuing someone as a person does not equate to acceptance of the sin. And so I do always make that distinguishment that I love you and I'm going to be your friend, or I'm going to be here for you and I love you as a person. But if you want my opinion on this particular sin, I'm always going to call it a sin. But that is not gonna be the first way I address someone, but and to condemn them to hell, or to tell them that they're going, to hell, or to tell them that they're sinning because I have my own sins. But I do try to make that distinguishment between there is a totality to how we treat people, and that totality has to, be understood with everyone has dignity, value, and worth despite their sins, but we can still call sin a sin without losing our compassion and empathy for other people.
I've got a sort of strange question for you. I just want to bounce it off you.
Okay.
Because sometimes I think about, there's a caricature of the Christian to be at the service of their fellow men, um, and, to put others first and these sorts of things. There's a grotesque caricature of that which springs to mind sometimes in this little fantasy I have when I imagine myself, okay, I'm coming home from work, long day of work, and I see someone in need, and it's like, oh my God, am I really gonna do the, okay, I'm gonna do the Christian thing. Okay, so I offer to help, hoping they'll say no. Okay. And then this is all a fantasy. It's just a fantasy that I have. Okay, but they say yes, and they need this from me, and so of course I give, and it's inconvenient, but whatever. I'm doing the Christian thing, pat myself on the back. And lo and behold, there's someone else there who has other needs and even greater needs. And then, of course, I'm in the mood to help them, so I help them. And to make a very long story short, because this is a very elaborate fantasy I have, I never make it home to my wife, and she goes hungry and she's depressed and worried about me, and she never sees me again because of the needs of all these people that I run into in this fantasy story. And I'm a fool. I'm a fool because I don't understand what it is to help my fellow man and to be at their service. Okay.
Right.
And the sad part of my fantasy is I end up being a slave of the most horrible person that has ill will towards me and towards everyone else. And basically, I'm just being tortured and imprisoned because I
Mhm.
wanted to be nice, right? So,
Sure.
obviously it's an exaggeration. Obviously, it's a caricature. But what is the remedy to that? What is the true moderate sweet spot in between being cold and heartless, like I don't have time for you, I got to go take care of my wife, and just giving yourself till you're a slave and wearing a gimp mask in someone's basement?
Well, I think it first begins with what kind of call God has on our life.
Uh,
Some people have a call from the Lord to join religious orders, and that's what they surrender their life to. But from a daily laity perspective, we can all do something. We can all take 5 minutes out of our time and pray for someone. We can all buy a meal for the homeless man we pass every day and hand them, a number three from Burger King or whatever. Even if we say we don't want to give them money because they're going to go buy drugs with it, which is judgmental, well, then give them food. And so I think we have to look at the needs around us and understand that we are limited as a human being, but that does not mean that we are exclusive to our family and friends. Because yes, we love to do things with our family and friends, but God called us to serve the world, and the world could be that one stranger that you can buy groceries for that is struggling and homeless, or it could be that one person. I love the stories of how people go through the drive-throughs like at Starbucks and they pay for the people behind them. And it could be something as simple as that to show that, you know what, I see you and I recognize you as a person. And then you let God do the rest. If you do one thing, God is going to multiply it to 100 because he's good at that. And that's what he does. And so it's not about serving and meeting every need. It's about meeting the needs that we are able to do. And yes, it's inconvenient at times, but it doesn't have to be life consuming unless you have that call to live a religious order life. But it certainly is part of our life, and we shouldn't ignore the needs of those around us.
it's a tricky thing, the whole selfishness and selflessness, because we don't often think of the dangers of selflessness, of foolish selflessness. And we do have examples of saints who were foolish in their selflessness.
Um,
And the,
yep.
the, the funny thing is that the church, if you listen to what the church has to say, often they will give like a cautionary note, like, don't try this at home type of thing. You know what I
Right.
mean? Have you heard that before? Where
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
here's this amazing story, but please don't go out and do this. It's like,
Kind of like, what was it? Was it St. Francis of Assisi that gave all of his clothes and stuff away and all of his men there? No, 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 no. Let's not do a streaking type of a thing.
yeah, because after the fact, we can look back and we can see the church can judge and say God was at work here in this person's life, even though it was strange, probably for those around this saint at the time, and it
Sure.
was it was even Christ himself was astonishing people. And it wasn't like everyone was like, oh, I feel so wonderful because I bumped into Jesus today. No, a lot of people were annoyed. A lot of people were angry. A lot of
Yeah.
people wanted to kill him,
Yeah.
right?
I
So
mean,
it's the same thing.
obviously because he died, right? And he flipped the tables over in the temple, right?
Don't try it at home, though. Don't try that at home, kids.
Don't flip the church tables over. You get mad at the mass, just don't flip the altar over. Don't do that.
My friend Daniel Drazinovich says, I like what this lady has to say. He also made a funny joke. He said to me, he said, have you been reading Oscar Wilde again? Because I gave my crazy fantasy
Oh.
story, I guess. I love Oscar Wilde. I love Oscar Wilde. I think he was repentant at the end of his life, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe so.
I think
Yes.
he repented. He was a genius, I think. And that's the exciting thing about the sexual deviance today, is that we don't know which ones are going to be great saints, which ones are going to be moderate saints, and which ones are going to be reprobates. We don't know. We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. But we do know that God wants them to be saints. He's going to do everything in his power to make them saints and to coerce them, with the carrot and the stick to
Right.
making better choices, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And Christ was good at that, and he set an example for that. And I think to some degree we can see that in Pope Francis. In many of the aspects, yes, He should do it in some other subjects, in other areas of concern, but he does kind of pave that path many times, to help others see where they're at in life and how they can get, to Christ, which is our ultimate purpose in life. But we're all on a journey, and we all have to point others to Christ. You're not going to be a saint without pointing people to Christ, because that's the purpose of the saints. And if we are not pointing people to Christ in our life here, we certainly can't do that in heaven. And so, if we want to be a saint, it begins with us. Instead of trying to make the church perfect, we need to try to make ourselves a lighthouse for those looking for Christ. And to do that, we have to look inward first.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna let you go here. I'm gonna go hang out with my wife because I've been spending the last 3 hours almost obsessing over Pope Francis, and she hates him. She hates him with a passion. So I gotta go. I gotta go take care of her and her
You got to
needs.
go make amends on that, right?
Yeah. I really do. I truly feel blessed in many ways because, I was converted to Christianity, Catholicism in 2009. But one of my blessings, one of the graces that I received that I think is somewhat rare, is that I really have a warmth and affection for the Vicar of Christ, Pope Francis. I do love him, I do like him, and I do admire him, and I do think he has a lot to offer. And I feel bad for people who are missing the entire point of this pontificate. They just don't see any value in the pontificate. They don't see any value in it.
No.
I feel pity for these people. I feel like, oh my God, you don't see what I see. Like, I mean, I'm not wearing rose-colored glasses. I know he's flawed, whatever, but you don't appreciate all the good stuff that God is giving you through Pope
Right.
Francis. Wow.
Well,
So,
and like I said at the beginning, I don't consider myself a pro Pope Francis. I don't consider myself an anti Pope. Now, admittedly, before I watched this, I was a little more anti Pope because I had kind of been annoyed with some of the things he had done. But this really kind of humanizes him and makes him a little more personal and gives you a complete understanding of where he's at on many subjects where they've twisted it in headlines. And so, I think we have to be open to humans and understand that he's a human, and we can get good things from people just like we can negative things. And so if we choose to just be exclusively anti-Pope or pro-Pope Francis, then we get tunnel vision, and tunnel vision is dangerous.
absolutely. Well, I think it's the easiest thing in the world to critique another human, and that includes
Sure.
the man who happens to be Pope. But I always say, respect for our elders is a dying art. Like we used to respect our elders, and we just don't anymore.
Yep.
I mean, that's if you want to set the bar really low with respect to criticizing Pope Francis publicly, disparaging his character, just think
Sure.
of him as an old man. Just
Yep.
think of him as an old man, and watch what you say, because
Yep.
that's not correct. It's
Yep.
just not polite,
That's right.
right? But I also see the mystical side where God Almighty has appointed this particular man at this particular time, and it's not 100% punitive. It's not just a punishment. It's not. It's not. It's not. I know that. I know that. So,
We have had much worse as folks.
so thank you so much. It's a joy
Sure.
talking with you as usual, and I can't wait to talk to you again. And reach out anytime. Okay.
Sure. No worries. Have a good one.
God bless you. Thanks for taking the time. We'll
You
talk
too. No
soon.
worries.
Goodbye.